U.S. History B, Unit 3, The Cold War, Day 7, The American Dream. Today's essential question: what was the American Dream? Main idea: the American Dream. Subtopics are We Like Ike, Sputnik, The Suburbs, and The Organization Man. I have to actually correct this. American Dream. Okay, so the subtopics are We Like Ike, Sputnik, The Suburbs, and The Organization Man. We're going to begin with I Like Ike. So remember that Dwight David Eisenhower came from nothing and got into West Point because it was free college. He wasn't especially interested in a military career, but it turned out he was really good at military stuff, particularly organization and delegating. The first time we see him in history is he is second in command when Hoover gassed the Bonus Army. The first in command for that little detachment that drove out the Bonus Army was Douglas MacArthur. And Eisenhower despised MacArthur and thought he was a prima donna. And MacArthur didn't especially like Eisenhower. So, after World War II, Eisenhower is the big American hero because he won in Europe, and he decides to run for president after President Truman. And both the Republicans and the Democrats know that the guy can't lose. He is massively popular. So he didn't actually belong to a political party, so he got representatives from both parties to talk to him, and he decided that he was a Republican. Now, when he was elected on two sort of contradictory things. The first was he would end the Korean War because the Americans were sick of World War II already, and then we got involved in the Korean War, and nobody talked about it because they just didn't want to be involved in war anymore. And that's why Korea was called the Forgotten War. So he said he would end that war. He also said he would fight communism. Those seem kind of contradictory because they are. I don't know. I think maybe people thought, like the Truman Doctrine, we'd fund people who were fighting communists in their own countries. I think they didn't really want to get involved in a second big shooting war with anybody. Then we'll go ahead and do it in Vietnam, but whatever. Also, as vice president, he chose Richard Milhous Nixon as his vice president because Nixon was a known communist hunter. Nixon had rooted out Alger Hiss, who was a State Department official who really was a communist spy, although he denied it, but those denials are pretty weak, according to modern historians. So Nixon was his vice president. Nixon will become president in 1968. That's why that's significant. Eisenhower had a moderate approach to governing. So he was sort of conservative and sort of liberal. He kept a lot of the New Deal programs, but he tried to spend less government money on domestic things. He was also very suspicious of what he called the military-industrial complex, and he gave a speech about it when he left. He thought that if you have big arms companies supplying a big military, that there will be motivation for constant warfare because there's too much money and power to be made. And he actually warned us about that. And that seems like it wasn't really taken very seriously at the time, but it sure has gained prominence since then. So I would like you to have 4 things for Eisenhower. 1, he said he would end the Korean War, and he did. 2, he said he'd fight communism, and I want you to throw Nixon in there. 3 things. And 3, he was moderate. So he wasn't all the way conservative and he wasn't all the way Democrat. So 1, end the Korean War, but still fight communism. And that's, 1, end the Korean War. 2, fight communism. And you can throw Nixon in there. And 3, he was moderate. He wasn't all the way conservative. He wasn't all the way liberal. The next thing we're going to talk about is Sputnik. So the Soviets, the Russians, wanted to show that communism was way better than capitalism. So they spent an enormous amount of money on getting to space first. They had also grabbed up a bunch of German rocket scientists, as we had. We called it Operation Paperclip. And they had tasked these German scientists with working with Russian scientists to develop rocket technology that would allow them to get to orbit. Now, there's some evidence that Werner von Braun, who was the head Nazi rocket scientist, actually put a rocket into space, but it didn't orbit. So it actually went up and came directly back down. It didn't circle around the Earth at least once. The Russians wanted to circle around the Earth at least once. And they did. They put a radio transmitter in like a basketball-looking satellite that's probably about that big. I've seen a model of it. It's more like a beach ball. They shot this thing up and it orbited the Earth a couple times and it went beep. And if you take 3 radio stations and you triangulate the thing, they could see how far off the ground it was by referencing 3 points. The radio waves come down and they could tell how long the waves are. And they used 3 points to triangulate it. The thing really was in orbit. My dad says that in El Paso, Texas, he could go out at night and he actually saw the thing crossing the sky. He could actually see Sputnik, which he thought was really cool. He didn't like it that the Russians had got there first, but it is cool. It was the first time human beings actually put something into orbit. And this caused the space race. So Eisenhower threw all kinds of money into school science programs, and we started throwing money at a space program. And we decided, all right, the Russians got something into space first, but we'll get the first animal into space. And then we didn't. The Russians put a dog into space. Her name was, I think, Laika. She was a proletarian dog, a communist working dog, like a stray dog from Moscow, I think is what they said. And they put her into orbit. Now, they didn't have the technology to bring her back alive. So they told the Russian people that as her orbit degraded, they would gradually turn off the air and she would go to sleep. But they didn't have the technology to do that. Actually, what happened was when Laika hit atmosphere, she burned up. So not a good end for Laika. And then after that, we threw a chimpanzee into space and we actually brought it back alive. And then we decided, all right, we didn't get the first object into space, we didn't get the first animal into space, but we're going to get the first human into space. And then we didn't. The first human into space was Yuri Gagarin, who was a Russian cosmonaut. But we did put the first people on the moon. John F. Kennedy said that by the end of the decade, by 1969, we would put people on the moon, and we did. And then we declared victory in the space race. I don't know. I like space. Space is cool. It seems like we're now taking a more international approach, that space is very expensive right now. So there are private companies like SpaceX trying to make it cheaper. But currently, we have the International Space Station. We also have been sending astronauts to the International Space Station on Russian rockets because we don't have a delivery system anymore because it was too expensive after our space shuttle program died. The military does have space vehicles. They announced that they had a military space shuttle fairly recently, but we don't get to know about that. But anyway, that's the space race. So for Sputnik, what I want you to write down is the space race. It started the space race. All right, for the suburbs. After World War II, the world's economies were destroyed, except for the United States and the Soviet Union. The reason why the Soviet Union's factories hadn't been blown up is because Stalin had moved all the factories past the Ural Mountains. So he moved all the factories so far to the east that Hitler couldn't get to them. So the Russians had factories that weren't bombed, and we had factories that weren't bombed. And anybody that wasn't a communist was buying American stuff, particularly American tractors and American cars. So the United States had 15 years of economic boom because all the world was buying our stuff. So there were jobs all over the place and money all over the place. And people took this money and they bought cars and they moved outside of cities to the suburbs. So the suburbs are suburban. They're not the country and they're not the city. They're somewhere in between. So the money leaves the cities and goes to the suburbs. Now, this had an effect on the inner cities. So people didn't live inside cities anymore if they had money. Those people took their tax dollars elsewhere, and the inner cities started to crumble. So now inner city is a term generally synonymous with run down, right? It affected public transportation and housing. Now, the people who left with the money tended to be Caucasians. So this is called white flight. So minorities suffered, working class people suffered because inner cities didn't have the infrastructure that they used to. So if you want to go on Google Images, Google inner city, and that's what you're going to find. So what do I want you to have for suburbs? Money and cars, people move out to the country. Working class suffers because the money had moved out to the country. So you get less public transportation, etc. If you go to Europe, public transportation is easy and abundant. Everybody uses it. People don't have to have cars in Europe. In the United States, in most places, you have to have a car if you don't live inside the city. And even if you do live inside the city, some cities have excellent public transportation, but a lot of cities don't. Like in Texas, go to Dallas or Houston, Texas. Texas is for the strong. You better have a car in Texas, right? So at least that's my experience. Finally, the organization man. So these soldiers come back and they get high-paying jobs and they immediately start having families. There's no birth control. So they get married and they have families and you get a baby boom. And when people talk about boomers, that's who they're talking about. They're talking about my parents. These are people born just after World War II. I'm Generation X. I think we start in like 1965 or something like that. I don't know. And then you get millennials, and then you get you guys. I think you're Generation Z, whatever. So you get a baby boom. Now, people wanted the good life. So they wanted, this is where you get the stereotype of the house in the suburbs and the 2 cars and the 2.3 children or whatever, the dog and the white picket fence and all that. And I'm not putting that down. That's how I live. It's a nice way to go. I don't want to live in a big city, and I don't want to run a farm. So I really like living in the suburbs. But what you saw in popular culture was the idea that everybody was going to live like this. And you get this social conformity thing. So if you look at the entertainment of the 1950s, it's really hard to find poor people, and it's really hard to find people who aren't white. And the people that you do find tend to talk the same and dress the same and have the same opinions. And this is called the organization man because what middle-class men were expected to do was buy a gray suit, a charcoal gray suit, and look like everybody else in charcoal gray suits. They're all war veterans, and this was sort of considered a uniform. And you go to the office and you live the same way. So that's the organization man. Companies were looking for particular people to be executives, right? And they tended to be male, white, in their 30s, etc. And this is all called social conformity. So what do I want coming off of organization man? I want you to write baby boom and social conformity, the idea that everybody was supposed to be the same. And that idea is flying away from culture now, right? Because we have all these different ideas coming in, and people are very concerned with diversity. So you could say that this generation seems to be the diversity generation. Well, the 50s, probably the social conformity generation, right? Okay. All right. That's what we have for you today. For your output, very easy output today, I want you to find a picture of a 1950s suburb that you think best illustrates what I've been talking about. And then we're going to take our test. So your test will be, I think it's May 1st. Let me check. All right. When's the next test? May 1st. Nope, it's May 4th. So your test will be Monday, May 4th. Thank you very much for sticking with me, and I will see you for Unit 4.